Hey guys, we're back talking about the Spanish voyages. Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy in 1451. He sailed on wooden boats to different Italian settlements in the Mediterranean in his teen years. And while doing this, he encountered indigenous people from the Canary Islands, and from these people, he learned he could sail west. After Columbus was shot down by a number of people in his attempt to sail and make a name for himself, he approached the Spanish crown with his project of finding a new route to Asia. The Portuguese had already established their route in the Indian Ocean, and the king and queen of Spain, that'd be Ferdinand and Isabella, agreed to fund a modest voyage. And Columbus set out in 1492 with letters of introduction to Asian rulers and an Arabic interpreter. He received backing from the rulers of Spain to sail across the Atlantic to Asia, searching for spices from the Indies. Columbus, he wasn't a really effective or good leader for that matter, and he didn't actually have control over the ships that accompanied him. This will be a problem later. Columbus realizes that a new landmass has been discovered, and after years, the Portuguese and Spanish agree to this as well. And they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, which effectively divides the world in half. I'll show you a map of what it looks like in just a moment. Remember how I said that Columbus wasn't a good leader? Well, here's the thing. He didn't figure out a way to actually compensate his men for sailing with him. And in 1503, the Spanish created the encomienda system as a way to administer the new territory and pay the people who went with Columbus. So effectively giving away land that doesn't belong to them and allowing these people to effectively say, I own the land, therefore I own you. Columbus wrote an account of his voyage, which he described to Ferdinand and Isabella, and they agreed to actually sponsor 3 more voyages. After these, Columbus was still certain that he had found Asia, but after he died a sad, bitter, broken, lonely man, and in debt, other Europeans realized that he discovered entirely brand new lands. Like I said, guys, this took a little while. And the land that was divided along a line drawn down the center of the North Atlantic would break up claims between Spain and Portugal. And Magellan's voyages across the Pacific confirmed Portugal's claim to the Molucca Islands and establishes the Spanish claim to the Philippines. So here we go. Very nice, very nice. You'll notice that, at least in terms of the Americas, Portugal was shut out, but anything unclaimed over here, they were allowed to take, which that's why so much of their territory is around this. So Columbus's voyages, but let's compare. Columbus versus Zhang He. The Ming ships were much larger, and they held many more men than Columbus's ships did. China was richer than Spain or Portugal and thus lacked the motivation to see new lands because they didn't have to. Columbus and other European explorers were deliberately seeking new lands to colonize, but the Ming were not using Zheng He's voyages to expand their empire. It was more about diplomatic relationships, tributary states, maybe some trading here and there, but nothing too major. Oh, look how cute they are compared to this. All right, so the principal voyages of exploration. So you might want to take a minute just to pause this, look at areas under Spanish versus Portuguese control, as well as the various routes that are being traveled on. So let's talk about Western Africa. Originally, the Portuguese viewed Africa as a source of gold. During the late 15th century, many Africans welcomed the Portuguese and profited from their trade, in which they often actually had the upper hand. Slaves were mostly procured from the west coast of Africa. The Atlantic slave trade was driven largely by the need for labor for sugar plantations. In return for their gold, Africans received from the Portuguese merchants a variety of Asian, African, and European goods, which actually included firearms. Interaction between the Portuguese and African rulers varied from place to place. The slave trade between Africa and Portugal disrupted the traditional treatment of captives of war in Africa. So there's two kingdoms we're going to discuss, Bena and the Congo. The Oba, or the king of the powerful kingdom of Bena, sent an ambassador to Portugal and established a royal monopoly on trade with the Portuguese. Bena exported a number of goods, including some slaves, and its rulers showed a mild interest in Christianity. But after 1538, the country purposely limited its contact with the Portuguese, declining to receive missionaries and closing the market in male slaves. The Congo king Afonso I, who reigned from 1506 to 1543, actually converted to Christianity. The Kingdom of Congo had fewer goods to export and consequently relied more on the slave trade, and this actually made them more reliant on Portugal. King Afonso complained to the King of Portugal that the Portuguese were no longer interested in conversion with Christianity, and they were enslaving not just people that were being traded, but they were also enslaving the people of the Congo as well. And as Afonso writes in a letter, this was not part of the deal. People of the Congo were not to be taken, and the Portuguese were doing that. And eventually, King Afonso loses his monopoly over the slave trade because the Portuguese simply disregard his wishes and do whatever they want. As a result, his power was weakened and some of his subjects actually revolted against him. The Atlantic slave trade was focused in the west of Africa. There really wasn't a major impact on the East Coast. In Eastern Africa, some Muslim states were suspicious of the Portuguese. Others welcomed the Portuguese as an ally in their struggle against neighbors. On the Swahili coast, Malindi befriended the Portuguese early on, and thus they're spared when the Portuguese attacked and looted the other Swahili city-states in 1505. We talked about that in the podcast from earlier. Christian Ethiopia sought and gained Portuguese support in its war against the Muslim forces of Adal. The Muslims were defeated, but Ethiopia could never make a long-term alliance with the Portuguese because the Ethiopians refused to transfer their religious loyalty from the Patriarch of Alexandria to the Roman Pope. So as you can see, Christian Ethiopia, you've got the city-states, and this was the ancient kingdom of Aksum, modern-day Ethiopia. All right, so the Americas. While the Portuguese built a maritime trading empire in Africa and Asia, the Spanish built a territorial empire in the Americas. And guys, this is a big difference. Portuguese have a maritime trading empire in Africa and Asia, Spanish a territorial empire in the Americas. And the reason for the difference are to be found in the isolation of the Amerindian communities, their relative military weaknesses compared to the Europeans, and their lack of resistance to old world diseases. So, as you know, when the Spanish come and when the Portuguese come to the Americas, they're bringing diseases that the people who are already there have never been exposed to. And this actually kills them faster than guns and steel. The Arawak were an agricultural people who mined and worked gold. They didn't trade it over long distances. And Spanish wars killed tens of thousands of Arawak and completely undermined their economy. In 1502, the remaining Arawak of Hispaniola were forced to serve as laborers for the Spanish. What the Spanish did in the Antilles was an extension of Spanish actions against the Muslims in previous centuries, defeating non-Christians, putting them and their land under Christian control, and then essentially turning the population into slaves. The actions of the conquistadors in other parts of the Caribbean will follow the same pattern. So this got cut off, but these are slaves who are working in a sugar mill. And this was a pretty common thing that would happen in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and in Haiti. We'll talk about the Haitian Revolution later on. But for now, let's focus on the Aztecs. The Aztec Empire of Mexico thrived from 1325 to 1519. Around 1325, the Aztec moved into central Mexico. The Valley of Mexico has many shallow lakes and fertile agricultural land. By 1300, there were over 50 city-states in central Mexico that will eventually be brought under Aztec control. The Aztec reclaimed large areas of land from the swamps and planted flowers whenever they could by building chinampas. The settlement of Tenochtitlan had about 200,000 people living in 60,000 dwellings. The Aztec society was one that privileged its warriors, and the weapons included spears, clubs, and darts. The Aztecs formed what was called the Triple Alliance in 1428 with two other tribes, and the conquered people provided tribute as well as volunteering, I say that word very loosely, to be sacrificial victims to the gods. Hernan Cortez of Spain led the conquest of Mexico. He landed in the Yucatan in about 1519, and there are numerous sources that we will read from both the Spanish and the Aztec about the conquest of Mexico. And one of the things that Cortez does is he makes friends with the enemies of the Aztecs. And believe me, they had a lot of them. The Tlaxcalan were one group that they actually allied with. And at first, the Aztec welcomed the Spanish into their capital city, which was not a good idea. They were devastated by smallpox and other diseases. Their king, Moctezuma, is kidnapped and eventually executed by Cortez. The Aztecs paid his ransom 2 rooms of silver and a room of gold, and he was still killed. In 1524, Franciscan friars arrived in Mexico and were welcomed by Cortez, and their mission was to convert as many Aztec as they could to Christianity. The Aztecs were defeated by the Spanish after 80 days of fighting. The survivors were enslaved. A similar fate would happen with the Inca Empire. The Inca is not as long-lived as the Aztecs, but their resistance lasted much longer. The Inca were divided into 2 classes, the common and the aristocrats. Above the local spirits were 3 main gods, the creator, the sun, and thunder. The Sapa Inca and the sun priest were considered to be part of the high class, and the Inca kept a complex ritual calendar. You should know that the Inca generally did not sacrifice people to the same extent that the Aztec did. Rarely, only on occasion. Generally, it was food, crafts, and animals that were sacrificed. The Inca settled the area around Cuzco in 1400. They conquered neighboring lands in search of goods, and they had herds of llama and alpaca, crops, gold, shells, and minerals. Inca warfare usually involved attacking enemy forts, cutting off their food and water supply until they surrendered. And the Inca also knew how to extract and process metal ore, and they were able to make bronze. The Inca army at one point had 100,000 men in a single battle. Once conquered, the Inca incorporated people into their empire and annexed their land. They did allow their conquered people a great deal of autonomy, and they took a census and divided people into groups on a regular basis. The main tax of the Inca was service to the state by the male head of a household. This was called the mita system. Some conquered people were forced to perform service for months. And each household in the Inca state was supposed to give certain goods, such as textiles, tools, or food, and this was actually used for trading. The Inca maintained 25,000 miles of road linking their empire. Subject people resented the heavy labor obligations of the Inca, which will play a role in their downfall later. Smallpox reached the Inca before the Spanish did. That's always how it works. The germs show up before the conquerors. The Spanish forces were led by Francisco Pizarro. Atahualpa received the Spanish peacefully into his city, but the problem is, if you remember from last week's podcast, the Inca are already unsteady due to a civil war. And because of this civil war, in which Atahualpa emerged as the winner, you already have questioned loyalty. But that being said, it takes 20 years for the Spanish to completely subdue the Inca, as opposed to the 80 days it took for Cortez to subdue the Aztecs. And a part of that is because the region, the mountains, where the Inca are, there are more places for them to hide and then to attack later on. All right, so just wrapping it up, we're talking about European exploration and motives for trade. So think about the role that Europe is playing, the beginnings of European involvement in the African slave trade, the motives for their exploration and expansion. Compare and contrast, think about this, guys, the conquest of the Aztec and the Incas, and really think about those connections that are happening between the empires, the connections, especially between sugar and the Atlantic slave trade, that will play a huge role with revolutions and rebellions. So, thank you for listening. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. And as always, have a great night, guys. Cheers.